Emily Rodriguez had worked the night shift at the Grandview Hotel for 10 years. 10 years of checking in guests, answering the same questions, watching strangers come and go. She thought she had seen everything, but on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, at 11:47 p.m., a man walked through those revolving doors and changed everything she thought she knew about her life. His name would unlock a secret that had been buried for 28 years, a secret that would make her question every truth she had ever been told. And it all started with a simple check-in.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The Grandview Hotel lobby gleamed under the soft amber lighting, its marble floors reflecting the crystalline chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling. Emily sat behind the mahogany reception desk, her fingers absently clicking the pen as she reviewed the night's reservation list. Tuesday nights were always quiet. Most business travelers checked in earlier, and the late arrivals were usually exhausted tourists who wanted nothing more than their room keys and directions to the elevator. She had perfected the art of invisible efficiency over the years. Guests rarely remembered her face, and that was exactly how she preferred it. At 28, Emily had built a comfortable life around routine and predictability. The hotel was her world, not an exciting one, but a safe one. After spending her childhood in the foster care system, bouncing between homes until she aged out at 18, safety meant everything. Margaret Chen, the night manager, emerged from the back office with 2 cups of coffee. At 55, Margaret had worked at the Grandview for nearly 30 years, rising from housekeeper to management. She was the closest thing to family Emily had ever known. Margaret set 1 cup on Emily's desk. The older woman had a 6th sense for when Emily needed company, even if neither of them spoke much during these quiet hours. The revolving door spun, and a man entered the lobby. Emily looked up from her computer screen, her practiced smile already forming, but something made her pause. He was tall, probably just over 6 feet, with dark hair that was slightly disheveled from travel. He wore a navy jacket over a wrinkled button-down shirt, and he carried a single leather duffel bag over his shoulder. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Emily's attention. It was something else. Something in the way he moved, or perhaps the way the light hit his profile as he approached the desk. Emily felt an inexplicable flutter in her chest. Recognition without memory. Familiarity without context. The man reached the desk and set down his bag with a tired sigh. Up close, Emily could see the exhaustion etched into his face. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw was tight with tension. He looked like someone who had been traveling for days, or perhaps someone running from something. She cleared her throat, forcing herself back into professional mode. Her fingers moved automatically across the keyboard, pulling up the reservation system. The man provided his confirmation number, his voice low and slightly hoarse. Emily typed it in, watching as his reservation appeared on screen. Daniel Morrison. 1 night. King bed. Non-smoking. Morrison. The name hit her like a physical blow. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. Morrison. Her mother's maiden name. The name Emily had only heard a handful of times in her entire life, whispered by social workers who had processed her paperwork after her father abandoned her at age 3. She tried to shake it off. Morrison wasn't an uncommon surname. There were probably thousands of Morrisons in the country. It was just a coincidence. But when she looked up at Daniel Morrison's face again, studying his features with new attention, something clicked into place. The shape of his eyes, almond-shaped with a slight downward tilt at the outer corners, the way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than his right, the small cleft in his chin. Emily had only 1 photograph of her mother, kept in a shoebox under her bed, a faded Polaroid from the late 1990s. She had stared at that photo countless times over the years, memorizing every detail of the woman who had died bringing her into the world. And now, looking at this stranger's face, she saw those same features staring back at her.
Her hands trembled slightly as she processed his check-in. Daniel Morrison didn't seem to notice her distress. He was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages with a furrowed brow. She needed to see his ID. Her heart pounded as she requested it, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license without looking up from his phone. Emily held the plastic card under the desk light. Daniel James Morrison. Date of birth, March 15th, 1994. That made him 30 years old, 2 years older than her. Address? Seattle, Washington. But it was the photo that held her attention. In the stark lighting of the DMV photo, his features were even clearer. The resemblance to her mother's photograph was undeniable. She forced herself to complete the check-in process, her movements mechanical. She explained the Wi-Fi password, breakfast hours, and checkout time, information she had recited thousands of times before. Daniel Morrison nodded absently at each piece of information, clearly eager to get to his room. As she handed him his key card, their fingers briefly touched. Daniel finally looked directly at her face, and for a moment, something cast between them, a flicker of recognition in his eyes too. But then it was gone, and he was thanking her and heading toward the elevators. Emily watched him disappear behind the closing elevator doors, her mind racing. Margaret appeared at her elbow. The older woman had been watching the entire interaction from her office doorway. Margaret's voice was soft but concerned. She asked if Emily was all right. Emily realized she was gripping the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. She tried to brush it off, claiming she was just tired. But Margaret had known her too long. The older woman's eyes narrowed with worry. Emily made an excuse about needing to check something in the back office. She hurried away from the desk, her legs unsteady beneath her. In the small office, Emily pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She opened her photo gallery and scrolled to the album labeled Family, though family was a generous term for the single photograph it contained. There she was, Sarah Morrison, Emily's mother. The photo was worn and faded, the colors slightly washed out. Sarah couldn't have been more than 25 in the picture. She stood in front of a Christmas tree, wearing a green sweater and a tentative smile. But it was her eyes that Emily always returned to, those same almond-shaped eyes with the slight downward tilt at the outer corners, the same eyebrow asymmetry, the same cleft in his chin. Emily pulled up the photo of Daniel's driver's license she had secretly taken with her phone. She held the two images side by side. It was impossible, and yet there it was. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidental. The specific combination of features, the eyes, the eyebrows, the chin, even the shape of their foreheads, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. Daniel Morrison was related to her mother, which meant he might be related to her. Emily's mind raced through the limited information she knew about her mother's past. Sarah Morrison had come from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, Washington or Oregon, the social worker had thought, though the records were incomplete. She had been young, only 21 when Emily was born. The father, Emily's father, was named James Rodriguez, a man who had proven unable to care for a toddler alone and had surrendered her to the system.
But what about Sarah's life before James, before Emily? Emily had always assumed her mother had no other family. If she had, surely they would have come forward when Sarah died. Surely someone would have claimed the baby girl who had survived the childbirth that killed her mother. But what if there had been family? What if Sarah had left someone behind? The office door opened, and Margaret entered. The older woman closed the door behind her and crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked almost like dread. Margaret asked what was wrong, and this time she wasn't accepting deflection. Emily showed her the two photographs, her mother and Daniel Morrison's driver's license. She explained the name, the features, the impossible resemblance. Margaret's face went pale. She sank into the desk chair, her hands pressed against her chest. Emily's concern shifted immediately to Margaret. She asked if the older woman was okay, if she needed water or her medication.
But Margaret waved her off. She was staring at the photographs with an expression Emily had never seen before. Shock, and something that looked disturbingly like guilt. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. She said she had hoped this day would never come. Emily's blood ran cold. She asked what Margaret meant. The older woman looked up at her, tears forming in her eyes. She said there were things about Emily's mother that Emily didn't know. Things Margaret had promised to keep secret. Things she had sworn never to reveal. Emily felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She demanded to know what Margaret was talking about. Margaret took a deep breath, seeming to wage an internal battle. Finally, she spoke. Sarah Morrison hadn't been alone when she came to this city 28 years ago. She had been running from something or someone. She had come to the Grandview Hotel desperate and pregnant, begging for a job, any job. Margaret had been a floor supervisor then, and she had taken pity on the frightened young woman. She had helped Sarah get hired as a housekeeper, had helped her find a small apartment, had been there when Sarah went into labor 3 months later. And Sarah had made Margaret promise something. Promise that if anything ever happened to her, Margaret would keep her past buried, would never let anyone from her old life find the baby. Emily's hands were shaking. She asked who Sarah had been running from. Margaret said she didn't know all the details. Sarah had been terrified to talk about it. But she had mentioned a family back in Seattle, a husband she had left, and a son. A son. The word hung in the air between them. Emily felt like she couldn't breathe. She asked how old this son would be now. Margaret did the math. He would be around 30, maybe 31. Emily looked down at Daniel Morrison's driver's license again. 30 years old. From Seattle. It couldn't be. It was too impossible, too perfect a coincidence. But deep in her gut, Emily knew. The same instinct that had made her pause when he first walked through those doors. The recognition without memory. Daniel Morrison was her half-brother. Emily stood frozen in Margaret's office, the truth settling over her like a heavy blanket. Upstairs in room 412, a stranger slept, a stranger who shared her blood, a stranger who might hold the answers to 28 years of questions. But as Emily stared at his photograph, one thought consumed her. Did he know about her? And if he did, why was he here?
Emily returned to the reception desk in a daze. Margaret had tried to convince her to go home, to take the rest of the night off, but Emily had refused. Going home meant being alone with her spiraling thoughts, and that seemed infinitely worse than maintaining the pretense of normalcy behind the desk. The lobby remained empty. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked toward 1 in the morning. Emily tried to focus on her computer screen, on the mundane tasks of her job, but her eyes kept drifting to the elevator doors. Room 412. Just 12 floors above her head. So close. What was she supposed to do with this information? March up there and knock on his door? Demand answers about a past he might not even know about? The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastating. Emily pulled out her phone again, staring at her mother's photograph. For 28 years, she had been an orphan. No family, no connections. Just Emily Rodriguez, alone in the world except for the kindness of strangers like Margaret. But now, everything had changed. She wasn't alone. She had a brother. Except she didn't really have him, did she? He was just a guest in her hotel. By noon tomorrow, he would check out and disappear back to Seattle, and she would be left with this knowledge and no way to process it. Unless she did something. Emily's finger hovered over her computer keyboard. She could pull up his reservation details, see his email address, his phone number. She could reach out after he left, send a carefully worded message. But what would she even say? Hi, I'm the hotel receptionist who checked you in. Also, I think I might be your half-sister. Surprise! The ridiculousness of it made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. The elevator dinged, and Emily's head snapped up. Her heart leapt into her throat as the doors opened. Daniel Morrison stepped out into the lobby. He had changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair even more disheveled than before. He carried an ice bucket in one hand and looked exhausted. He approached the desk, and Emily felt her pulse racing. Daniel asked where the ice machine was, apologizing for bothering her. His voice was rough with fatigue. Emily directed him to the alcove near the elevators, her voice somehow remaining steady despite the chaos inside her head. Daniel thanked her with a tired smile and turned to go. She watched him walk away. This might be her only chance. Tomorrow, he would be gone. She would lose this opportunity forever. The words came out before she could stop them. She asked if he was having trouble sleeping. Daniel paused and turned back. He gave a rueful laugh and said that was an understatement. He admitted he hadn't slept well in weeks. Emily found herself asking if everything was okay. It was none of her business, but she couldn't help herself. Some part of her needed to know more about this stranger who was her brother. Daniel hesitated, studying her face. For a moment, Emily thought he would brush off the question and leave. But something in her expression must have invited confidence, because he walked back to the desk. He said it was a long story. Family stuff. He was in town trying to track someone down, and it was proving more difficult than he had expected. Emily's heart stuttered. She asked, as casually as she could manage, who he was looking for. Daniel set down the ice bucket and leaned against the desk. He seemed to be weighing how much to share. Finally, he said he was looking for his half-sister, a sister he had only recently learned existed. The world tilted. Emily gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Daniel continued, unaware of the bomb he had just dropped. He explained that his father had passed away 2 months ago. In going through his father's papers, Daniel had found documents that revealed his mother had been pregnant when she left their family 30 years ago, and she had given birth to a daughter, his half-sister. Emily could barely breathe. She managed to ask why his mother had left. Daniel's expression darkened. He said he didn't know all the details. His father had never spoken about it when he was alive, but from what Daniel had pieced together from old letters and documents, his mother had been very young when she married his father, only 18. The marriage had been difficult, and when she got pregnant with Daniel, things had gotten worse. He paused, seeming to struggle with the next part. He said his father hadn't been a good man. He had been controlling, possessive. There were hints in the letters that suggested he had been abusive, though his mother had never explicitly stated it. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Daniel continued. When Daniel was 2 years old, his mother had gotten pregnant again, and she had made a choice. She left in the middle of the night, taking nothing with her. She had disappeared completely. Daniel's father had told him that his mother had abandoned them, that she didn't want to be a mother anymore. Growing up, Daniel had hated her for it. But now, reading his father's papers, Daniel understood. She had been running for her life, and she had been trying to protect the baby she was carrying. Emily's eyes burned with unshed tears. She asked what had happened to her mother. Daniel's voice dropped. He said she had died in childbirth. The baby girl, his sister, had survived, but her mother had not. She had died alone in some city hundreds of miles from home, with no one who knew her real story.
Emily had to tell him. She had to. The words were right there, pressing against her lips. But Daniel kept talking. He said he had been searching for his sister for 2 months now. He knew she had been born here in this city. He knew his mother had lived here for a brief time before her death, but after that, the trail went cold. The baby had been placed in foster care, and the records were sealed. He had hired a private investigator, but they were hitting dead ends. He looked directly at Emily, and the pain in his eyes was raw and real. He said he just wanted to find her, to tell her about their mother, to let her know that she wasn't unwanted, that their mother had loved her enough to risk everything. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. She tried to wipe them away quickly, embarrassed. Daniel looked alarmed.
He apologized profusely, saying he shouldn't have dumped all of this on her. She was just trying to do her job, and here he was, unloading his family drama on a stranger. But Emily shook her head. She said he wasn't dumping anything. She understood what it was like to search for family, to want answers about where you came from. Daniel tilted his head, studying her more carefully. He asked if she was adopted. Emily hesitated, then nodded. She said she had been in foster care, never adopted. She had aged out of the system at 18. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Sympathy, understanding, a connection forming between two people who knew what it meant to be abandoned. He said he was sorry. That must have been hard. Emily shrugged, trying to appear casual despite her racing heart. She said she had survived. She had built a good life for herself. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his tired face. He said she seemed like a strong person. His sister would be lucky if she turned out half as well adjusted as she appeared to be. The irony of his words nearly broke her. Emily knew she had to tell him. This was the moment. She opened her mouth, ready to reveal the truth, but Margaret appeared from the back office, her expression tight with warning. She cleared her throat loudly, interrupting the moment. Margaret said there was a problem with some paperwork that needed Emily's immediate attention. Her tone made it clear this was not optional. Daniel took the hint. He grabbed his ice bucket and apologized again for keeping Emily from her work. He wished her a good night and headed back to the elevators. Emily watched him go, frustration and confusion warring inside her. As soon as the elevator doors closed, Margaret pulled Emily into the back office. The older woman was firm. She said Emily couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not like this. Emily protested. She said Daniel deserved to know. He was searching for her. He was right there. Why should she keep the truth from him? Margaret's expression was pained. She said there were things Emily didn't understand. Complications. Emily demanded to know what complications. Daniel seemed like a good person. He was clearly trying to make things right. What possible reason could there be to keep the secret? Margaret took a deep breath. She said that when Sarah Morrison came to this city 30 years ago, she had been terrified, not just from her husband, but of what he might do if he found her, if he found the baby. Emily argued that Daniel's father was dead. There was no threat anymore. But Margaret shook her head. She said Daniel's father wasn't the only person Sarah had been afraid of. There were others, family members who knew about the abuse but had done nothing, who had pressured Sarah to stay, who had told her it was her duty as a wife. Margaret revealed that Sarah had made her a promise. If anything happened to her, if anyone ever came looking for the baby, Margaret was supposed to protect her, keep her hidden. Because Sarah believed, rightly or wrongly, that bringing her daughter into the Morrison family would only bring danger. Emily sank into a chair, her head spinning. She asked if Margaret really thought Daniel was dangerous. Margaret admitted she didn't know. He seemed genuine, but she had made a promise to a dying woman, a promise she had kept for 28 years. Emily looked up at her, tears streaming freely now. She said she finally had family, someone who shared her blood, someone who was actively searching for her. How could Margaret ask her to turn her back on that? Margaret knelt beside her chair and took Emily's hands. She said she understood. She truly did. But she needed Emily to be careful, to think this through, to not rush into something that might have consequences neither of them could predict. She proposed a compromise. Tomorrow, she would make some calls, contact some old friends who might have more information about the Morrison family, do some research on Daniel himself, make sure he was who he seemed to be. Emily wanted to protest, but some rational part of her brain acknowledged that Margaret had a point. She knew nothing about Daniel Morrison except what he had told her in a late-night conversation. What if he wasn't being entirely truthful? What if there were things he was hiding? She agreed to wait, to let Margaret investigate, but only for a few days. Margaret squeezed her hands and promised she would work quickly. Emily returned to the reception desk feeling emotionally drained. The rest of her shift passed in a blur.
Every time she heard the elevator ding, she jumped, half hoping and half dreading that Daniel would appear again. But he didn't. At 6 in the morning when her shift ended, Emily sat in her car in the parking garage and pulled up her mother's photograph again. She zoomed in on Sarah Morrison's face, searching for answers in those familiar features. Who had her mother really been? What kind of life had she escaped? And why, after all these years, did the truth still need to be kept hidden? Emily drove home to her small apartment and collapsed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to Daniel's words. His sister would be lucky if she turned out half as well-adjusted as she appeared to be. If only he knew. Emily lay awake as dawn broke, staring at her ceiling. In a few hours, Daniel would check out. He would leave, still searching for the sister who had been standing right there in front of him. Margaret's warnings echoed in her mind, but so did Daniel's voice when he spoke about his mother's sacrifice. Emily had 6 hours to decide, respect a dead woman's wishes or claim the family she'd always dreamed of. The choice should have been simple, but nothing about this was simple.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emily returned to the hotel at noon, unable to stay away. It was her day off, but she had texted Margaret, saying she needed to be there when Daniel checked out. She needed to see him one more time before he disappeared, even if she couldn't tell him the truth yet. Margaret had been reluctant, but understanding. She had agreed to let Emily wait in the back office, out of sight. But when Emily arrived, Margaret met her at the employee entrance with an urgent expression. She pulled Emily into an empty conference room and closed the door. Margaret explained that Daniel Morrison had extended his stay. He wouldn't be checking out today after all. He had booked the room for 3 more nights. Emily's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She asked why he had extended. Margaret said he had told the front desk clerk that he had a lead, someone who might have information about his sister. The words sent a chill through Emily. She asked if Margaret knew who this someone was. Margaret's expression was grave. She said she had made those calls she promised. She had reached out to some contacts, people who had known Sarah Morrison during her brief time in the city, people who might remember details. And that's when things had gotten complicated. Margaret had revealed that one of her old friends, a woman named Helen, who had worked at the hospital where Sarah gave birth, had a son who now ran a private investigation firm. When Margaret had called Helen to ask discreet questions about Sarah Morrison, Helen had mentioned that just yesterday, a private investigator working for a Daniel Morrison had contacted her son's firm requesting records and information. Emily began to understand. She asked if Margaret's call had tipped someone off. Margaret nodded grimly. She explained that Helen, knowing Margaret's connection to the hotel and remembering that Sarah had worked there, had mentioned to her son that someone at the Grandview might have known Sarah. The private investigator had apparently passed this information to Daniel. Emily sank into one of the conference room chairs. She asked what this meant. Margaret said it meant Daniel knew that someone at this hotel had information about his mother and possibly about his sister. He would start asking questions, showing photographs, investigating the staff. Emily's mind raced. She said maybe this was good. Maybe this was the universe's way of forcing her to tell him the truth. But Margaret shook her head. She said there was more. Margaret had done her research on Daniel Morrison. She had looked into his background, his family, his life in Seattle. And while Daniel himself seemed legitimate, no criminal record, steady employment as an architect, seemingly normal life, his family was another story. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Emily a news article. It was from a Seattle newspaper dated 15 years ago. The headline read, "Prominent Seattle businessman Richard Morrison accused of fraud." Emily scanned the article. Richard Morrison, Daniel's father, had been the owner of a construction company. Multiple former employees had accused him of various illegal practices: bribery, intimidation, wage theft. The case had eventually been settled out of court, with Richard Morrison paying substantial fines but admitting no wrongdoing. Margaret scrolled to another article, and another. Over the years, Richard Morrison had been involved in multiple lawsuits. Nothing that had sent him to prison, but a clear pattern of unethical and possibly illegal behavior. Emily looked up at Margaret. She asked Daniel's father was dead. What did this have to do with Daniel? Margaret showed her one more article. This one was more recent, from just 5 years ago. It showed a photograph of Daniel Morrison standing beside his father at some charity event. The caption identified Daniel as the vice president of Morrison Construction. Emily felt her stomach sink. She asked if Daniel had been involved in his father's business. Margaret said she had tried to find out. The business had folded 2 years ago, shortly after several more lawsuits. Daniel had apparently left the company and moved into freelance architectural work. Whether he had participated in his father's illegal activities or had been an innocent bystander was unclear. Emily stared at the photographs. Daniel looked different in these pictures, younger, more polished, wearing expensive suits, but his eyes were the same. Those same eyes that had looked at her with such genuine pain last night when he talked about finding his sister. She asked Margaret what she thought this meant. Margaret said she didn't know, but she thought they needed to be careful. Sarah Morrison had been terrified of her husband and his family. Maybe she had good reason. Emily argued that Daniel seemed nothing like his father. He had been kind, genuine. He was searching for his sister because he wanted to make things right. Margaret agreed that was possible, but she pointed out that abusers are often charming. People who commit financial crimes are often trusted in their communities. Richard Morrison had appeared to be a respectable businessman, and yet he had been a monster behind closed doors. Emily felt defensive anger rising in her chest. She said Margaret was being unfair. She was judging Daniel based on his father's sins. Margaret's expression softened. She said she wasn't judging. She was just being cautious for Emily's sake. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Emily asked Margaret what she thought she should do. Margaret thought that Emily should meet with Daniel, talk to him properly, ask him questions about his father, his family, his intentions, get a real sense of who he was before revealing her identity. Emily was skeptical. She asked how she was supposed to do that without seeming suspicious. Margaret smiled slightly. She said she had an idea. 20 minutes later, Emily found herself back in her hotel uniform, standing at the reception desk. Margaret had arranged for her to cover the afternoon shift, replacing one of the regular clerks. It wasn't unusual. Emily often picked up extra shifts when the hotel was short-staffed. And now she would be there when Daniel came down. She could observe him, talk to him casually, maybe learn more about who he really was. The plan felt deceptive, but Emily couldn't deny a part of her wanted this, wanted the chance to interact with her brother without the weight of revelation between them. She didn't have to wait long. At 2:30, Daniel emerged from the elevator. He looked better than he had last night, showered, clean-shaven, wearing jeans and a casual button-down. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. He approached the desk and smiled when he saw Emily. He said he was glad to see her again. He admitted he was worried he had scared her off with his emotional dump last night. Emily assured him he hadn't. She asked if he was having a better day. Daniel's smile widened. He said he actually was. He had gotten a lead on his search. Someone at this hotel might have known his mother. Emily kept her expression neutral. She said that was great news and asked if he knew who. Daniel admitted he didn't have a name yet. His investigator was still tracking down the information, but he was hoping to talk to some of the long-term staff members, see if anyone remembered a Sarah Morrison who had worked here in the late 90s. Emily felt her pulse quicken. She said she had only been working here for 10 years, so she wouldn't have been around then. But there are a few staff members who had been here longer. She could ask around for him.
Daniel's face lit up. He said that would be amazing. He pulled a photograph from his portfolio and handed it to Emily. It was a picture of Sarah Morrison. Not the same one Emily had, but from around the same time period. Sarah looked young and beautiful, but also sad. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Emily stared at the photograph, seeing her own features reflected back at her. She forced herself to breathe normally. Daniel explained that this was taken about a year before his mother left. He asked if Emily would mind showing it to the older staff members, see if anyone recognized her. Emily agreed, carefully keeping her hands steady as she took the photograph. She said she would ask around and let him know if she learned anything. Daniel thanked her profusely. Then he asked if she had a moment. There was something he wanted to ask her. Emily's heart hammered. She said, of course. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed. He said this might be inappropriate, but their conversation last night had meant a lot to him. He had been feeling alone in this search, and it had been comforting to talk to someone who understood what it was like to grow up without family. He asked if Emily would be willing to meet him for coffee later, not as a guest and hotel employee, but just as two people. He said he could use a friend in this city, and he thought maybe she could too. Emily knew she should say no. This was getting too complicated. But the loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness she recognized in her own mirror every day, made the decision for her. She said yes. She would meet him for coffee. They agreed on 6 o'clock at a cafe down the street. Daniel thanked her again and headed out, presumably to meet with his investigator. As soon as he was gone, Margaret appeared from the back office. She had been listening to the entire conversation. Emily expected Margaret to lecture her about the dangers of getting too close to Daniel, but instead, the older woman looked thoughtful. Margaret said she had been watching Daniel's face when he looked at Emily, when he talked to her, and she had seen something that surprised her. Emily asked what? Margaret said she saw genuine warmth, kindness, none of the controlling behaviors she had learned to recognize in abusers during her years managing a hotel and encountering all types of people. She admitted she might have been too quick to judge him based on his father. People were not their parents' sins. Emily felt a surge of vindication. She asked if this meant Margaret thought Emily should tell Daniel the truth. Margaret hesitated. Then she said she thought Emily should go to coffee with him, talk to him, learn more about him, and then decide. But she had one condition. She wanted to be there when Emily told him, not hovering but nearby, just in case. Emily agreed. It seemed reasonable. The afternoon passed slowly. Emily tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting to the approaching meeting. What would she say to Daniel? How would she steer the conversation to learn more about him without revealing her own connection to his search? At 5:30, Emily changed out of her uniform and into her civilian clothes. Margaret walked with her to the cafe, then positioned herself at a table on the opposite side of the room, ostensibly reading a book. Daniel arrived exactly at 6. He had changed into a fresh shirt and had obviously made an effort with his appearance. The nervous energy around him was palpable. They ordered coffee and settled into a corner booth. For a few minutes, they made small talk. The weather, the city, Daniel's work as an architect. The conversation flowed easily, and Emily found herself genuinely enjoying his company. But then Daniel grew serious. He said he wanted to thank Emily for agreeing to meet him. He knew it was strange forming a friendship with a hotel guest, but he felt connected to her somehow. Emily's throat tightened. She said she felt it too. Daniel smiled sadly. He said, I thought it was because we were both searching for something. Him for his sister, her for... Well, he wasn't sure what Emily was searching for, but he suspected everyone who grew up without family was searching for something. Emily found herself opening up in a way she rarely did. She talked about her childhood in foster care, the constant moving, the feeling of being unwanted, the way she had built walls around herself to avoid being hurt again. Daniel listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he said he understood more than she might think. He explained that growing up with a father like Richard Morrison hadn't been much better than growing up without one. His father had been present physically, but absent emotionally. The man was cold, controlling, critical of everything Daniel did. Daniel admitted he had spent his 20s trying to win his father's approval. He had worked at Morrison Construction, even though he hated it. He had watched his father engage in practices that made Daniel's stomach turn. He had told himself he was staying to change things from the inside, but really he had just been a coward. It wasn't until his father had another lawsuit, this one involving an employee who had been seriously injured on a construction site due to Richard's cost-cutting safety violations, that Daniel had finally found the courage to leave. He had testified against his father in that case. It had destroyed whatever relationship they had left. Emily felt tears pricking her eyes. She said that took incredible courage. Daniel shook his head. He said it took too long. People had been hurt because he had stayed silent for years. He would carry that guilt forever. That's why finding his sister meant so much to him. He couldn't undo his past mistakes, but he could try to do something right. He could give his sister the family connection she deserved, tell her about her mother's sacrifice, make sure she knew she had been wanted, loved. Emily reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture was instinctive, born from a need to comfort him, but the moment their hands touched, something electric passed between them. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes intense. He said there was something else he needed to tell me, something he probably shouldn't say but couldn't keep inside anymore. Emily's heart hammered. She asked what it was. Daniel took a deep breath. He said that when he first walked into the hotel last night, when he had seen Emily behind the desk, he had felt something, a recognition. Like some part of his soul knew her. He admitted it sounds crazy. We're strangers. But he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her wasn't a coincidence, that she was supposed to be part of his journey somehow. Emily's eyes flooded with tears. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. This was it. This was the moment. She had to tell him. But before she could, Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression changed. He apologized and said he had to take this. It was his investigator.
He answered the phone, and Emily watched as his face went from hopeful to confused to something that looked like shock. Daniel ended the call and stared at his phone for a long moment. Emily asked what was wrong. Daniel looked up at her, his expression strange. He said his investigator had just sent him some information. The person who had known his mother at the hotel, the lead he had been following, was a woman named Margaret Chen. She had been a floor supervisor when Sarah Morrison worked there. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel continued. The investigator had discovered that Margaret had been present at the hospital when Sarah gave birth. She had been listed as Sarah's emergency contact. She had been the one to make arrangements after Sarah died, which meant Margaret Chen knew what had happened to his sister. She knew where the baby had gone. Daniel stood up, his body thrumming with energy. He said he needed to go back to the hotel right now. He needed to talk to Margaret Chen. Emily stood too, panic rising in her chest. She tried to think of what to say, how to explain, but Daniel was already heading for the door. He turned back and asked if Emily was coming. After all, she worked there. She could introduce him to Margaret. Emily followed him out of the cafe in a daze. Across the room, she saw Margaret standing too, her face pale with understanding of what was about to happen. The three of them walked back to the hotel in tense silence. Daniel was focused, determined. Margaret looked resigned, and Emily felt like she was walking toward something inevitable and terrifying. They entered the hotel and made their way to the conference room. Margaret suggested they talk privately there, away from the public areas of the hotel. Once inside, with the door closed, Daniel wasted no time. He told Margaret he knew she had known his mother. He needed her to tell him what she knew about his sister, where the baby had gone, how he could find her. Margaret looked at Emily. A silent question passed between them. Emily gave the smallest nod. Margaret took a deep breath. She told Daniel to sit down. But Daniel remained standing. He said he had been sitting for 2 months, waiting, searching. He needed answers now. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. She said he needed to sit down, because what she was about to tell him would change everything. Something in her tone made Daniel comply. He sank into one of the conference chairs, his hands gripping the armrests. Margaret looked at Emily again. She asked if Emily was sure. Emily nodded, though her whole body was shaking. Margaret turned to Daniel. She said she did know his mother. Sarah Morrison had been a beautiful, frightened young woman who had worked at this hotel for 3 months before she died. Margaret had been with her at the hospital, had held her hand as she gave birth,
had promised to protect her baby. Daniel leaned forward. He asked where the baby was now. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She said the baby was right here. Daniel looked confused. He said he didn't understand. Margaret gestured to Emily. She said Emily Rodriguez was his sister. The room fell into absolute silence. Daniel turned to look at Emily, his face a mask of incomprehension. He said that wasn't possible. That was ridiculous. Emily was just a hotel employee who... He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes widened as he really looked at Emily's face, as the resemblance to their mother's photograph finally clicked into place. Emily watched as understanding washed over him, followed by disbelief, then something that looked like betrayal. Daniel stood up abruptly. He asked how long Emily had known. Emily's voice shook as she said since last night, since she saw his name in his face. Daniel took a step back, running his hands through his hair. He said she had known this whole time, during their conversation last night, during coffee just now. She had let him pour his heart out about searching for his sister, and she had known the entire time. Emily tried to explain. She said she had been in shock. She hadn't known what to do. Margaret had wanted to make sure it was safe before... Daniel cut her off. Safe? Safe from what? From him? His voice rose with anger and hurt. He said he had opened up to her, trusted her, felt connected to her, and she had been lying to him the entire time. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. She said she hadn't been lying. Everything she had told him was true. She just hadn't told him all of it. Daniel laughed bitterly. He said that was the same thing his father used to say. Leaving out the truth was just another form of lying. The comparison stung. Emily said that wasn't fair. She wasn't anything like his father. Daniel's expression hardened. He said he didn't even know who she was. He had thought he was connecting with a kind stranger, but it had all been manipulation. She had been watching him, studying him, deciding whether he was good enough to know his own sister. Margaret tried to intervene. She said that wasn't how it had been. They had just been trying to be careful. But Daniel turned his anger on Margaret. He said she had no right to keep his sister from him, no right to judge him based on his father's actions. He said Sarah Morrison had been his mother too. She had left him behind. He had spent 30 years wondering why, hating her, then finally understanding her sacrifice. And now he had been searching desperately for the only family he had left, and they had made him beg for information that should have been freely given. Emily sobbed. She said she was sorry. She had wanted to tell him. She had been about to tell him at the cafe. Daniel asked why. What had stopped her? Emily couldn't answer, because the truth was fear had stopped her. Fear that he would be like his father. Fear that he would hurt her. Fear that her fantasy of having a brother would be destroyed by reality. Daniel seemed to deflate. The anger drained out of him, replaced with a deep sadness. He said he understood now. They had looked at him and seen Richard Morrison. They had assumed he was a monster because his father had been one. He asked if Emily had ever considered that maybe he had been searching for family too, that maybe he was just as lonely and desperate for connection as she was. Emily reached for him, but Daniel stepped away. He said he needed time. He needed to process this. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Without turning around, he said he had spent 2 months searching for a sister he thought would want to be found. He hadn't considered that when he finally found her, she might not want him. Then he left, the door closing quietly behind him. Emily collapsed into a chair, her entire body shaking with sobs. Margaret wrapped her arms around her, but no comfort could touch the devastation Emily felt. She had finally found family, and she had destroyed it before it even began.
The conference room felt suffocatingly empty after Daniel left. Emily couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The brother she had just discovered, the family she had dreamed of her entire life, now saw her as a liar, someone who had manipulated and judged him. Margaret tried to intervene, but Emily couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. She had made a choice, and she had chosen wrong. But as she sat there, drowning in regret, Emily didn't know that the real truth, the one that would shatter everything again, was still hidden in Margaret's silence.
Emily didn't go home that night. She couldn't bear the thought of being alone in her apartment, staring at her mother's photograph, wondering how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Instead, she stayed at the hotel. Margaret had offered to let her sleep in one of the vacant rooms, but Emily couldn't sleep. She sat in the back office, staring at the wall, replaying every moment of the past 24 hours. She kept coming back to the look on Daniel's face, the betrayal, the hurt, the way he had said she might not want him. That was the worst part, because he was wrong. She did want him. She wanted a brother more than she had wanted anything in her 28 years. But she had been so focused on protecting herself, on being cautious, that she hadn't considered how her caution might hurt him. Around 3 a.m, Margaret entered the office with 2 cups of tea. She sat down across from Emily without speaking, just offering the warm cup. Emily took it gratefully. Her hands were still shaking. Margaret finally spoke. She said she was sorry. This was her fault. She had let her promise to Sarah Morrison cloud her judgment. She had made Emily doubt herself, doubt Daniel, when maybe they should have just trusted in the goodness she had seen in both of them. Emily shook her head. She said it wasn't Margaret's fault. Emily was an adult. She had made her own choices, bad ones. Margaret asked what Emily wanted to do now. Emily said she didn't know. Daniel was still staying at the hotel. She would see him eventually, but what was she supposed to say? How could she fix this? Margaret suggested giving him time. Let him process. Then, when he was ready, Emily could try to talk to him. Really talk, honestly. Emily agreed, though the thought of waiting felt unbearable. The next day passed in a fog. Emily went through the motions of her shift, constantly aware of Daniel's presence somewhere in the building. She saw him once, from a distance, crossing the lobby on his way out. He didn't look her way. By evening, Emily couldn't stand it anymore. She had to try. Even if he rejected her, she needed to at least attempt to make things right. She went up to room 412 and knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Emily pulled out her phone and called Daniel's number, the one from his reservation information. It went straight to voicemail. She left a message, her voice breaking. She said she was sorry, so incredibly sorry. She had been wrong to hide the truth from him. She had been scared and foolish, but she wanted to try again. She wanted to be his brother, if he would let her. She waited by the phone for hours, no response. The next day was the same. Emily tried calling again, left another message, sent a text, nothing. She asked the front desk if Daniel had checked out, but they said no. He was still staying in room 412. He just apparently wasn't answering his door or his phone. Margaret suggested Emily write a letter, something tangible that Daniel could read when he was ready. Emily spent hours crafting it. She told him everything about her childhood in foster care, about the loneliness that had defined her life, about seeing his name and face and feeling for the first time like she belonged to someone. She apologized for the deception, explained Margaret's promise to their mother, said she understood if he couldn't forgive her, but she hoped he could. She ended the letter by telling him about their mother's photograph, the one that she had kept under her bed for years. She described it in detail, the green sweater, the Christmas tree, the sad smile that never reached her eyes. She wrote, "I've stared at that photo thousands of times, memorizing every detail of a woman I never got to know. And when I saw your face, I saw her. I saw us. I saw the family I've been searching for my entire life. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But please know that every word I said to you was true. The connection I felt was real.
You are my brother, and I want to know you. Whenever you're ready." She slipped the letter under his door and waited. 2 more days passed. Daniel remained silent. Emily was working the evening shift when Margaret called her into the office. The older woman looked troubled. Margaret said she had spoken to the housekeeping staff. They had noticed something concerning about room 412. The Do Not Disturb sign had been on the door for 3 days straight. No housekeeping had been allowed in. No service had been requested. Emily felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. She asked if anyone had actually seen Daniel. Margaret said no, not since the day after their confrontation in the conference room. Emily's mind raced to dark places. What if something had happened to him? What if he had been so upset that she couldn't finish the thought. Margaret said they needed to do a welfare check. Hotel policy required it, after a certain amount of time with no contact. Emily and Margaret went up to the 4th floor together. Emily's heart pounded as they approached room 412. The Do Not Disturb sign hung on the handle. Margaret knocked loudly, identifying herself as hotel management. Still nothing. She knocked again, saying they needed to verify the guests' well-being. Still nothing. Margaret looked at Emily, her expression worried. She pulled out her master key. The door opened, and they stepped inside. The room was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of belongings. The bed was made, the bathroom was clean, there was no luggage, no personal items, nothing to indicate anyone had been staying there. Emily's letter lay on the desk, unopened.
Margaret immediately called the front desk. She asked if Daniel Morrison had checked out. The front desk clerk said no. According to the system, he was still an active guest. His reservation ran through tomorrow. But clearly, he was gone. Margaret asked if there had been any charges to his room, any activity on his account. The clerk said no, nothing since the day he had checked in. Emily sank under the edge of the bed, her mind spinning. Where was he? Why had he left without checking out, without taking his reservation to completion? Margaret was already on her phone making calls. First to hotel security, reviewing camera footage. Then to the police, filing a missing person report. Though they said they couldn't do much since Daniel was an adult who had presumably left of his own volition. Emily picked up her letter from the desk. It was still sealed. He had never even opened it. The security footage showed Daniel leaving the hotel the morning after their confrontation. He had been carrying his duffel bag. He had walked out the front entrance and disappeared down the street. He had left, chosen to leave, had walked away from his search, from his sister, from everything. Emily felt like her chest was caving in. She had driven him away. Her fear and hesitation had cost her the only family she had ever had a chance to know. Margaret tried to comfort her. She said maybe Daniel just needed more time. Maybe he would reach out eventually. But Emily knew better. Daniel had been searching for a sister for 2 months. He had been desperate to find her. And when he finally did, she had shown him that he wasn't wanted, that he wasn't trusted. Why would he ever come back? Emily went home that night feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. And that was saying something for someone who had spent most of her childhood in foster care. She pulled out her mother's photograph and stared at it through her tears. She wondered what Sarah Morrison would think of her daughter now, whether she'd be proud of Emily's caution or disappointed by her cowardice. The next morning, Emily woke to her phone ringing. For a wild moment, she hoped it was Daniel, but it was Margaret. The older woman's voice was strained. She said Emily needed to come to the hotel immediately. There was something she needed to see. Emily arrived within 20 minutes, her heart pounding. Margaret met her at the employee entrance and led her to the office without a word. Once inside, Margaret closed the door and pulled out a manila folder. Her hands were shaking. She said she hadn't slept the night before. She had been consumed with guilt about everything that had happened, about the choices she had made, the secrets she had kept. And she had realized there was something else, something she had never told Emily, something she had promised herself she would take to the grave. But she couldn't do it anymore, not after watching Emily's heartbreak, not after seeing the damage that secrets could cause. Emily felt a new dread settling over her. She asked what Margaret was talking about. Margaret opened the folder and pulled out several old documents. Hospital records, birth certificates, legal papers. She explained that when Sarah Morrison had given birth to Emily, things had been complicated. Sarah had been in labor for nearly 20 hours. There had been complications. The doctors had been worried they might lose both mother and baby. In those desperate hours, Sarah had been delirious with pain and fear. She had said things, confessed things to Margaret, who had stayed by her side the entire time. Margaret's voice broke as she continued. Sarah had told her the real reason she had run, the real truth about her marriage to Richard Morrison. Emily's blood ran cold. She asked what the truth was. Margaret said that Daniel wasn't Sarah's son. Emily felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She asked what Margaret meant. Margaret explained that Sarah had married Richard Morrison when she was only 18. It hadn't been a love match. It had been arranged by their families, two prominent Seattle families joining together. But before the wedding, Sarah had been in love with someone else, a young man named James, Emily's father's name. Margaret continued. Sarah had been pregnant when she married Richard. Richard had known it. It was part of the arrangement. He wanted a wife from a good family, and he was willing to raise another man's child as his own in exchange for the social status the marriage would bring. Daniel was James's son, not Richard's. But James was unstable, struggling with depression and addiction. When Daniel was born, James had tried to be involved, but Richard had made it clear he wouldn't tolerate interference. There had been threats, violence. James had been pushed out of Daniel's life entirely. Sarah had stayed in the marriage, raising Daniel while trapped with a controlling, abusive man who resented this son for not being his biological child. Richard had been cruel to Daniel, constantly comparing him unfavorably to other children, making it clear he would never be good enough. When Sarah got pregnant again, this time with Richard's biological child, everything had changed. Richard had been possessive of this baby in a way he had never been with Daniel. He had talked about finally having a real heir. And Sarah had realized that Richard would treat her children completely differently. Daniel would continue to be neglected and emotionally abused, but this new child, Richard's biological child, would be treasured and controlled in equal measure. So Sarah made a devastating choice. She left, taking her unborn child with her. She had chosen to save one child, knowing she was abandoning the other. But Emily was Richard Morrison's biological daughter, not James Rodriguez's. The room spun. Emily couldn't breathe. She asked if that meant Daniel wasn't her brother? Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She said Daniel was her half-brother, but not in the way they thought. They shared a mother, but had different fathers. More importantly, Daniel had spent 30 years being raised by a man who wasn't his biological father, a man who treated him terribly, partly because Daniel wasn't his blood. And Emily was the biological daughter of that same monster. Emily felt sick. She asked why Margaret had never told her this. Margaret said Sarah had made her swear. Sarah had been terrified that Richard would find out the truth and come looking for Emily. That's why Sarah had arranged for Emily to be given James Rodriguez's last name on the birth certificate, to create a false trail, to make it look like James was Emily's father. Sarah had died believing this secret would protect her daughter, that Richard Morrison would never know he had a biological child out there. But now that secret had poisoned everything.
Emily realized with horror what this meant. Daniel had spent his entire life being treated as less than by a man he believed was his father. And if he ever found out the truth, that he wasn't Richard's son, that Emily was, it would destroy him. He would realize that the sister he had been searching for was actually the biological child his father had wanted, the real heir to the Morrison name. Emily asked desperately if Daniel knew any of this. Margaret said she didn't think so. Richard Morrison had taken that secret to his grave. As far as Daniel knew, Richard was his biological father. Emily buried her face in her hands. This was worse than anything she could have imagined. She had hurt Daniel by not telling him the truth, but the actual truth was so much more painful than either of them had known. Margaret said there was more. She pulled out another document from the folder. It was James Rodriguez's death certificate. He had died 3 years after Emily was born. Overdose. But there was something else. A letter, yellowed with age, addressed to Sarah Morrison. Margaret explained that James had written this letter shortly before his death. It had been sent to the hotel, where Margaret had received it. Sarah was already dead by then, but Margaret had kept the letter, not knowing what else to do with it. She handed it to Emily. With trembling hands, Emily unfolded the aged paper and began to read. James wrote about his regrets, about losing Sarah, about being kept away from Daniel, about his struggles with addiction. He said he was trying to get clean, trying to be better, because he had heard Sarah had another child now. His child. He wrote that he knew he had no right to be a father. He had already failed Daniel so completely. But he wanted Emily to know, someday, that he had loved her mother, that Daniel had been created from that love, and that even though James had never been able to be the father either of his children deserved, they had been wanted. Both of them had been wanted. Emily's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. All this time, she had believed James Rodriguez was her father, that he had abandoned her because he couldn't cope after Sarah died. But James hadn't been her father at all. Her real father was Richard Morrison, a man who would have controlled and possibly abused her if he had known she existed. And James had died believing Emily was his daughter, had died with love in his heart for a child who wasn't even biologically his. Emily looked up from Margaret through her tears. She said she didn't know what to do with this information, how to process it, how to move forward. Margaret said she didn't know either, but she thought Emily deserved to know the whole truth, even if it was messy and painful and complicated. Emily asked if she should tell Daniel. Margaret's expression was pained. She said that was Emily's choice to make, but she warned that the truth could do more harm than good. Daniel had finally found peace with his father's death, learning that Richard Morrison hadn't been his biological father and that Emily was, might destroy that peace. Emily realized she was facing another impossible choice. Tell Daniel the truth and risk hurting him even more, or keep the secret and build their relationship on yet another foundation of lies. She said she needed time to think. Margaret agreed. She said whatever Emily decided, she would support her. Emily left the hotel in a daze. She drove aimlessly through the city, her mind churning through everything she had learned. She had spent 28 years believing she was Emily Rodriguez, daughter of James and Sarah, an orphan with no family. But she wasn't Emily Rodriguez at all. She was Emily Morrison, the biological daughter of an abuser, the half-sister of a man who had every reason to resent her existence. And somewhere out there, Daniel was still searching for answers, still trying to understand why their mother had left him behind. Emily knew she had to find him. She had to try to make this right, even if she had no idea how. She pulled over and called the private investigator number that Daniel had mentioned. She explained who she was and that she needed to get in touch with Daniel urgently. The investigator was initially reluctant, client confidentiality. But when Emily explained that she was the sister Daniel had been searching for, the investigator's tone changed. He said he would pass along the message, but he warned her that Daniel had already called to cancel the investigation. He said he was done searching. Emily's heart sank, but she left her contact information anyway. Then she waited.
3 days passed with no word from Daniel. Emily went through the motions of her life,
going to work, eating, sleeping, but she felt like a ghost, hollowed out and drifting. On the fourth day, she received a text from an unknown number. "It's Daniel. Can we talk?" Emily's hands shook as she typed her response. "Yes, anytime, anywhere." The reply came quickly. "The hotel, conference room, tonight at 8. Emily arrived at 7:30, too anxious to wait. Margaret had agreed to be nearby again, but this time, Emily was determined to handle this herself. At exactly 8 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Daniel stepped inside. He looked different, tired, older somehow, but also calmer, like he had been through a storm and come out the other side. They sat down across from each other, the same table where everything had fallen apart days before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. He said he had been angry when he left. Furious, actually. He had felt betrayed and manipulated, and like a fool. Emily started to apologize, but Daniel held up his hand. He said he needed to say this. He had spent the last few days driving up and down the coast, thinking, processing, and he had realized something. He had been angry at Emily for lying to him, but the truth was, he had been lying to himself for years. He had told himself he was searching for his sister to honor their mother, to make things right. But really, he had been searching for someone to save him. Someone who would prove that he deserved to be loved, that he wasn't the worthless disappointment his father had always told him he was. And when he found Emily, when he felt that connection with her, part of him had latched onto it desperately. She'd represented everything he had been looking for. Someone who understood loneliness. Someone who needed family as much as he did. But then, when she had hidden the truth from him, it had felt like rejection, like proof that he wasn't good enough, that even his own sister didn't want him. Daniel's voice cracked. He said he realized that reaction said more about his own damage than it did about Emily's choices. Emily wiped tears from her eyes. She said he deserved to be angry. She had made wrong choices. She had let fear control her. Daniel shook his head. He said he understood why she had been cautious. She didn't know him. She only knew that their mother had run from his father, that there had been abuse in his family. He said Emily had every right to protect herself, to take time to figure out if he was safe. Emily sobbed. She said he was safe, more than safe. He was kind and honest, and everything she could have hoped for in a brother. Daniel smiled sadly. He said he hoped that was true because there was something he needed to tell her. Emily's stomach clenched. She asked what? Daniel explained that after he left the hotel, he'd gone back to Seattle. He needed to go through his father's papers more thoroughly, try to understand everything. And he had found something, hidden in a locked box in his father's office. DNA test results from almost 30 years ago. Richard Morrison had, apparently, had doubts about Daniel's paternity. He had secretly had Daniel tested as an infant. The results had confirmed what he suspected. Daniel was not his biological son. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel continued. He said that according to the documents, his biological father was James Rodriguez, the man Richard knew was involved with Sarah before their marriage. Emily couldn't breathe. She asked if Daniel knew about Emily's connection to James. Daniel looked confused. He said according to Emily's birth certificate, James Rodriguez was her father too, which meant they were full siblings, not half. Emily realized he didn't know. He didn't know that the birth certificate was a lie, that Emily wasn't actually James's daughter. This was her moment. She could tell him the truth, that she was Richard Morrison's biological child,
that they were only half-siblings, that her father, the man who had treated him so terribly, had been her real father. Or she could say nothing. Let him believe the lie that their mother had created. Let him have the comfort of thinking they were connected by both parents. Emily looked at Daniel's face, saw the hope there, the fragile peace he had found in discovering that Richard Morrison hadn't been his biological father, that he hadn't inherited that man's blood after all. If she told him the truth, she would take that away from him. She would put herself between him and his healing. But could she build a relationship with her brother on a lie? Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes secrets protect us. Sometimes they destroy us. Knowing which is which requires wisdom I'm not sure anyone possesses. Emily made her choice. She took Daniel's hand and said she had something to tell him too, something Margaret had revealed to her a few days ago. She told him everything, about the letter James had written, about how James had loved our mother, about how James had died believing Emily was his daughter, even though he hadn't been able to be a father to either of them. She pulled up the letter and gave it to Daniel. He read it with tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he looked up at Emily and said he had spent his whole life believing he wasn't wanted, that he wasn't enough. But reading this letter, knowing that somewhere he had a father who loved him, even if that father had been broken and unable to show it, meant everything. Emily squeezed his hand. She said they both had been wanted. Both had been loved. Their mother had sacrificed everything to protect one child while leaving the other behind. Their father had loved them both, but hadn't been able to be there for either of them. It was messy and painful and complicated, but it was their truth. Daniel asked if Emily could forgive him for running away, for not giving her a chance to explain. Emily said there was nothing to forgive. She asked if he could forgive her for lying. Daniel said he already had. They sat there for a long moment, holding hands across the table. Two broken people who had found each other. Two half-orphans who were now a little less alone. Finally, Daniel said he had something else he wanted to say. He said he'd been thinking about what it meant to be family, and he had realized that family wasn't just about blood. It was about choosing each other, showing up for each other.
He said he wanted to be Emily's brother, not because they shared DNA, but because he chose her, and he hoped she would choose him too. Emily pulled him into a hug, both of them crying. She said she chose him. 1,000 times over she chose him. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret knocked quietly on the door. She asked if she could come in. Emily and Daniel both nodded. Margaret entered with a soft smile. She said she had something for them. She pulled out 2 photographs, copies of the same image. Their mother, Sarah Morrison, in that green sweater in front of the Christmas tree. Margaret had made a copy for Daniel. She said Sarah had left this photo at the hotel when she went into labor. It had been in her locker. Margaret had kept it all these years, not knowing what else to do with it. Now, both of her children could have a piece of her. Daniel stared at the photograph, seeing his mother for the first time. He traced her features with his finger and said she looked young, scared, but also strong. Emily said she looked like someone who made the hardest choice any mother could make, leaving one child to save another. Daniel nodded. He said he understood why she did it, and he didn't hate her for it anymore. The 3 of them sat together in that conference room, 3 people bound by love and loss, and the messy, complicated truth of being human. Margaret told them stories about Sarah, what she had been like in those brief months she had worked at the hotel, her quiet laugh, her love of old movies, the way she would sing softly to her unborn baby when she thought no one was listening. Emily and Daniel absorbed every detail, building a picture of a mother they had never known, but had both inherited pieces of. Eventually, Margaret left them alone, sensing they needed time to just be siblings. Daniel asked Emily what happened now. Emily said she didn't know, but she wanted him in her life, however that looked. Daniel said he wanted that too. He had already arranged to work remotely from the city for the next few months. He wanted to get to know her, build a real relationship. Emily's heart soared. She said she would love that. They could take it slow, get to know each other properly, build something real. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He said he had one more question. He asked if Emily would show him where their mother was buried. Emily's expression fell. She said she didn't know. She had tried to find out years ago, but the records were unclear. Margaret thought Sarah had been buried in the city's public cemetery, but there was no headstone, no marker, nothing to show that Sarah Morrison had ever existed. Daniel's jaw tightened. He said that wasn't right. Their mother deserved to be remembered. An idea formed in Emily's mind. She said maybe they could do something about that, together. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Daniel worked with Margaret to locate their mother's grave. It took research, phone calls, and old hospital records, but they finally found her. An unmarked plot in the corner of the public cemetery, identified only by a number in the cemetery's records. They arranged for a proper headstone. Simple but beautiful. It read, Sarah Morrison Rodriguez, beloved mother. She chose love over fear. On a gray Saturday morning, the three of them stood at the grave for a small ceremony. Just Emily, Daniel, and Margaret. No formal service, just three people who had all been touched by Sarah's brief life. Daniel placed a bouquet of flowers on the grave. He said he forgave her, for leaving, for dying, for all of it. Emily knelt and touched the cold stone. She said thank you, for giving her life, for protecting her, for making the impossible choice that had kept her safe. Margaret simply stood in silence, tears streaming down her face, finally able to release the promise she had carried for 28 years. As they walked back to the parking lot, Daniel put his arm around Emily's shoulders. He said he had been thinking about their story, how improbable it all was. The chances of him checking into that specific hotel on Emily's shift had exactly the right moment. Emily said she used to think life was just random, a series of accidents and coincidences, but meeting him had made her wonder if maybe some things were meant to happen. Daniel asked if she believed in fate. Emily considered the question. She said she didn't know about fate, but she believed in choice. Their mother had made a choice to protect her even though it meant leaving Daniel behind. Daniel had made a choice to search for his sister, even when the trail seemed cold. Emily had made a choice to trust him, despite her fears, and Margaret had made a choice to finally tell the truth, even though it broke a decades-old promise. Those choices had led them here, to this balcony, to this moment, to being family. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Many asked if Emily ever wondered about the truth she hadn't told him, about Richard Morrison being her biological father. Emily's heart stopped. She asked what he meant.
Daniel pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. It was a DNA test result. Recent, dated just a few weeks ago. He explained that he had been curious. After finding out that Richard wasn't his biological father, he had wondered about his genetic heritage, where he came from, what else might be hidden in his DNA. So he had done one of those consumer DNA tests, the kind that showed you your ancestry and connected you with genetic relatives, and the results had come back with a match, a half-sibling match to someone who had also taken the test. Daniel had done some research, cross-referenced the information, and he had figured it out. Emily wasn't James Rodriguez's biological daughter. She was Richard Morrison's. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. She asked how long he had known. Daniel said about 3 weeks. He had been trying to figure out how to bring it up, whether to bring it up at all. Emily sobbed. She said she had been trying to protect him. She hadn't wanted him to feel like she was the real Morrison child, the one their father would have wanted. Daniel set down the paper and took both of Emily's hands in his. He said he understood why she had kept it secret, and he loved her for trying to protect him. But he said she needed to understand something. Learning that Richard Morrison was her biological father didn't change anything about how he felt about her. Because the truth was, Richard Morrison had been a sperm donor at best.
Nothing more. He had never known Emily, never raised her, never had any part in making her who she was. James Rodriguez, on the other hand, had loved them both. Imperfectly, from a distance, but genuinely. And their mother, Sarah, had loved them enough to sacrifice everything. Those were the people who made them who they were. Not DNA, not biology. Love and choice and sacrifice. Daniel said Emily was his sister. Full stop. Not his half-sister, not his sister with an asterisk. His sister. And nothing, not DNA tests, not family secrets, not complicated biology, would ever change that. Emily pulled him into a hug, both of them crying. She said she loved him so much. Daniel said he loved her too, and he always would. They stayed on that balcony long into the night, talking about everything, the secrets they had kept, the truths they'd uncovered, the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of being family. Eventually, Daniel asked what Emily wanted to do with this information. Did she want to tell Margaret? Did she want to acknowledge it publicly? She thought about it. Then she said she wanted to do what their mother had done. Make a choice to protect the people she loved. She said as far as she was concerned, she was Emily Rodriguez, daughter of James and Sarah, sister of Daniel. That was her truth, her choice. The biology could remain a footnote, a secret that only the two of them shared, because it didn't define them. Their choices defined them. Daniel agreed. He said they could be the Morrison-Rodriguez siblings, a hyphenated family built on love rather than blood. Emily laughed through her tears. She said that sounded perfect.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.